All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Otsego area MPART PFAS Town Hall meeting. Glad to have so many of you on with us on this beautiful evening, Wednesday, or May 10th. Before I hand it off to our MPART Director, Abigail Hendershot, I'm just going to run through some quick logistical slides. My name is Jim Ostrowski, and I work in Eagles and Environmental Support Division. And I'm gonna kind of kick this off, and you'll see me at the end, and I'll be in the background throughout the meeting helping out. So in terms of logistics, all lines are muted tonight. When we get to the Q&A portion of the night, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we can unmute your line. But until then, the lines are muted. We are also recording this meeting like we do with all our public meetings, and you'll find it up on our YouTube channel in the next day or so. Also want to remind you to keep an eye on the chat, your Zoom chat, because throughout the evening we'll be throwing up a couple links and things like that you might find of use. Like I mentioned, if you have a question tonight, we're going to have time for Q&A after our presentation. You can put your question in the Q&A box. And that'll put it in our queue to ask the question. You can also raise your hand, like I said, and that'll key us to unmute your line and call your name and unmute you. There's a couple people, it looks like, that might be on the phone tonight. So if you're on the phone listening in, of course, you can't see my slide, but if you have a question, you can hit #2 on your phone. Again, that's #2, and that'll indicate that you have a question, and we will call you by your telephone number and unmute your line over the phone. With that, I'm going to turn over to Abigail Hendershot, and Amy Peterson is going to share her slides. So go ahead, Abby.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate everyone coming tonight. This is one of a series of town halls that we have done in the Otsego area since 2018. I believe we've done 3 others virtually and at least 1 or 2 in person. So going back to 2018, there has been a series of these. So we will cover some of the basics tonight, some of the basics of PFAS, some of the history, but just know that this has been an ongoing project. One of the other things you'll hear tonight is that we will be posting 2 additional sites as part of the investigations from these. So you'll see our panelists, speakers will talk about that. And then I just want to really appreciate all of you for coming tonight, attending virtually. I know a lot of people would have preferred to do an in-person meeting. Having it in the virtual format allows us to not only record it, but also allows us to have statewide participation, which is something that's a unique feature of being able to do these. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, let me go through logistics first. Thank you, Amy. So tonight I'll just be doing introductions. Fred Sellers, our regional lead for Eagle, is going to do the MPART overview. Lisa Fisher will go through our health slides, again, covering those basics. Ray Spalding is our project manager from Eagle. He will be touching on the investigation areas. We will have some information from Matt Pfister with our surface water investigations. Heather Bishop's going to talk about community water supply issues in and around the area. And then we will come back in, like Jim said, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So feel free at any point to enter a question into the question and answer box, and then we can answer those at the end and make sure we get back to you. All of those questions are also recorded as part of this recording session, and so we will see those and make sure that we can get an answer back to you as well. So I think those are all the things on my list. So let me turn it over to Fred Sellers, our regional lead for the Kalamazoo district. Fred?
Thank you, Abby. So as Abby said, my name is Fred Sellers. I'm the MPART Kalamazoo region lead, and I'm just be going over a brief overview of the MPART Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. So Michigan's PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART for short, was created as an enduring body under executive order to ensure coordination by the 7 state agencies working on the PFAS response. MPART also coordinates with the federal government on several programs and projects, and we partner with local officials at the project level. We think that our data-driven science-based approach coupled with MPART communication structure is the reason we've been so successful at rapidly identifying potential PFAS exposures. So PFAS are a class of man-made chemicals that have one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. PFAS compounds repel water, oil, fat, and grease. They're used as surfactants and they're highly stable. Industry began developing PFAS compounds in the 1940s, and there are over 5,000 PFAS compounds today. We're concerned about PFAS because they're widespread in the environment. They don't break down easily, very difficult to get rid of. Some bioaccumulate, which means they build up in our bodies and the bodies of fish and wildlife. And some may have health impacts, which Lisa Fisher will explain further later on. As I said, there are over 5,000 of these chemicals, and we don't know a lot about many of them. And they're also, we lack national standards. Next slide. So this slide shows just some of the many uses for PFAS, everything from cosmetics, outdoor gear, again, waterproofing, stain resistance. They're just everywhere. So next slide. So this diagram shows two things. One, how PFAS cycles through our environment, and two, places that MPART is sampling. So if we imagine, if we start off in the upper left-hand corner of this, we see an industry that's manufacturing a product. They may use PFAS as part of their process. And in turn, as part of their process, they may discharge wastewater to the ground or into a river or stream, or even to a wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants weren't designed to treat for PFAS, so wastewater treatment plants then discharge to rivers. Wastewater treatment plants also deal with sludge, known as biosolids, that may contain PFAS. So that sludge could end up in a landfill, and landfills generate leachate, which is then often taken to a wastewater treatment plant for treatment. Also, some wastewater treatment plants land apply biosolids, where PFAS could be taken up by plants, could run off to a river, or end up in the groundwater. So we are moving PFAS around in the environment, and our challenge is to understand the occurrence of PFAS and try and break that cycle. The second reason we talk about this diagram is because we're sampling at many of the points on this map. So we may sample groundwater, surface water, residential wells, and soil. And we do that at a variety of places. And you see at the upper right-hand corner, you see some residents with residential wells. And each time we find a new PFAS site, our first step is contact local health departments and DHHS to determine if residential wells need to be sampled. Next slide. So this slide just shows the table of drinking water and groundwater standards that we compare our sample data to. Next slide. So as part of our PFAS testing, we're now including PFAS in our surveys of lakes, streams, and fish to eliminate any additional sources of contamination and exposures from people, to people. Next slide. So as of today, Michigan has 248 official sites. I think today's are 247 and 248, where groundwater contamination exceeds our cleanup criteria. These are military installations, landfills, industrial sites, airports. And although we have more sites than any other state today, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're more contaminated. We just have more because we've been looking more rapidly and comprehensively than anyone else. We also are still investigating many more of thousands of potential sites. And our prioritization is on investigating sites with potential impacts to drinking water. Next slide. So the Citizens Advisory Work Group, or COG, is made up of citizens from impacted communities around the state. This work group has two key charges. The first is to recommend to MPART how to better engage and empower communities. The second is to recommend ways for MPART to better educate the general public. The COG has a web page on the PFAS response team website. It includes their charter, meeting information, and members. Anyone that is interested in becoming a member simply need to submit a registration form that's found on the COG webpage. So next, Lisa Fisher will talk about the role of Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
All right, thanks, Fred. So my name is Lisa Fisher. I'm a toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the human health outcomes associated with PFAS exposure and what the role of DHHS and local health is in these investigations. So our role is to understand the unique health concerns facing your community. And while Eagle leads the site investigation, DHHS, along with the local health department, lead any public health planning and response actions that may be needed. So we evaluate PFAS exposures to residents in the community and then recommend public health actions as needed. So like Fred said, there's a lot of different ways that we can be exposed to PFAS chemicals because they are in so many products. One of the major pathways of exposure is by drinking contaminated water, but some other exposure pathways include eating fish caught from water bodies that contain PFAS. We do have Eat Safe Fish guidelines available, some of which are driven by PFAS. Another exposure pathway includes incidental swallowing of contaminated soil or dust, or eating foods that have been packaged in materials containing PFAS, and then the use of consumer products as well. And PFAS absorption through the skin is typically not a concern. It's more the ingestion pathway where you're actually swallowing PFAS, either through drinking water or food, that we're most concerned about. So this is a graph that shows blood levels of 4 common PFAS in people from the United States from the years 2000 to 2018. And you can see that the PFOS or PFOS levels in blood have decreased over this period of time. And the use of PFOS and PFOA have kind of been phased out in the United States, and you see that reflected in the blood levels as well. But a lot of manufacturers have replaced the use of PFOS and PFOA with other PFAS that have a shorter half-life and a shorter carbon chain. We just don't have as much information about the human health outcomes associated with those shorter chained PFAS that are being replaced. Next slide. So some of the human health outcomes associated with high exposure to PFOA and or PFOS include these. These include reduced fertility, high blood pressure or preeclampsia in pregnant women, small decreases in infant birth weight, higher cholesterol, especially total and LDL cholesterol. We've got some more thyroid disease, liver damage, decreased immune system response to vaccines, and for PFOA exposure at high levels, kidney and testicular cancers. And it's important to note that just because someone has had high exposure to these PFAS compounds doesn't mean that they will develop these health outcomes, since there's many factors that go into the development of these diseases. So we use multiple lines of consideration when we're determining if there's any public health response actions that need to take place. So I'm going to talk about some of these on the next slides, but we use our MDHHS comparison values, as well as looking at residential well results, both individually and collectively for an area. And we also look at site-specific information to determine if public health response actions are needed. So I'll go into each of these on the following slides. So when I say the MDHHS comparison values, they're the lowest of 2 health-based screening values that we have, both the MDHHS public health drinking water screening levels and the MPART health-based values or maximum contaminant levels. And both of these are health-based, which means they're set to protect everyone. And they also include sensitive populations that are most at risk of harm to their health, which in this case are fetuses and breastfed babies. So this shows what the comparison values are for the 7 PFAS that we have comparison values for. And the levels are different because there are different toxicities associated with each of these PFAS. So that's why the comparison values are not all the same value. Next slide. So when we do residential well sampling in an area, we're looking at results of a person's well, both individually, whether they have PFAS in their well, and then for the whole area that we sampled wells in as well. So we have 2 examples shown here on this slide. The first is there's a house in the middle that has PFAS levels, but they don't exceed any of our comparison values. They don't exceed any health-based criteria, and they're surrounded by homes that didn't have any detections of PFAS. So if we didn't have any other site information that, made us think there was a high-strength source in the area or something like that, then, we may not need to offer any further public health response actions for that house in the middle. However, if we go over to the other one, it's the same house, so levels of PFAS that don't exceed any health-based criteria, but they're surrounded by homes that do. In that case, we would probably offer them, some sort of alternate water or some sort of public health response action just to make sure that they were protected. So this is just one of the many factors that we use when determining if public health response actions are needed. And we also take into consideration site-specific information. So we rely on Eagle for a lot of this information. We want to know if there's a known or suspected source in the area. We also look at the geology. How deep are these wells? Are they fairly shallow where they may be more prone to contamination issues? Or are they deep wells that have confining clay layers that are less prone to contamination issues? And then if there is a known plume in the groundwater, we want to know which direction that plume is moving in, so that we can, target other homes for residential well PFAS sampling. So these are all factors that we take into consideration, when we're trying to determine how to protect public health. I also wanted to touch on our Eat Safe Fish program because that's housed under DHHS. For this area, we have several fish consumption advisories for the Kalamazoo River. And for the stretch of the river between the Allegan Dam and the Morrow Dam, there's been a do not eat fish advisory in place for several years. And that's due to historical PCB contamination. And you can find out more on our Eat Safe Fish program website, which is at michigan.gov/eatsafefish. And then I was just going to touch on the residential well sampling results for the Otsego area. And so originally there were 62 residential drinking water wells that were sampled for PFAS. And those 62 wells were also sampled for a number of other contaminants. And the results of those 62 wells indicated that PFAS were the only contaminants present at levels that may pose a health risk. And as Eagle will discuss later, the investigation into land applications continued in the area. And so we continue to sample more wells for PFAS. So currently the state has sampled 224 residential wells for PFAS. Of those 224, 169 or 76% have been non-detect for PFAS. 30 or 13% had detections of PFAS, but did not exceed any of the comparison values. And then 25 or 11% exceeded one or more of the comparison values. You can go to the next slide. So residents whose well water had exceedances of the comparison values were offered a free point of use filter, and those residents continue to be supplied with replacement cartridges. And we also supplied filters to some residents whose water didn't exceed the comparison values, but we had some site-specific information that indicated that they may be at risk. And so we did provide point-of-use filters to some of those residents as well. So in total, we've provided 29 filters. We also expanded the residential well sampling based on the PFAS results. Like I explained in the last slide, we started off with 62 residential wells that were sampled. And then as the investigation continued, we expanded that residential well sampling. We also provided all the residents with a results letter that had the PFAS results, the lab reports in them, and it also included educational materials as well. And one of the public meetings, I know we talked to residents about their PFAS results, and we also call residents to let them know what the results were as well. Next slide. So this is a map that shows where all the residential wells have been sampled in the Otsego investigation area. And the green dots show the wells that were non-detect for PFAS. The yellow dots show the wells that had detections of PFAS but didn't exceed any of the comparison values. And the red dots show the residential wells that had detections of PFAS that exceeded one or more of the comparison values. Next slide. And finally, I just wanted to say that DHHS is planning on sampling more residential wells this year. We're targeting Otsego Township and Gun Plain Township, and this includes 57 wells that will be sampled for the first time and 34 wells that will be resampled. And the homes that we're targeting for this next round of sampling will meet one or more of the following criteria. They need to be on a property that is on or down gradient of historical land applications. They need to be a property that previously had PFAS detections through the state of Michigan sampling, whether that was through Eagle or DHHS, or they need to be near residential wells that previously had PFAS levels that exceeded one or more of the comparison values. And so we will be notifying these residents of our intent or want to sample they'll receive a letter in the mail from Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And with that, I will turn it over to Ray to talk about the site investigation.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm Ray Spalding. I'm the PFAS site lead for the Otsego area study, and my contact information is up on the screen. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns that you may have. Next slide. Looking back on the Otsego area study, in 2018, concerned residents held a meeting and asked the state to investigate what they perceived as an elevated health risk in the greater Otsego area. Eagle agreed to identify contaminated properties that may pose a health risk. Eagle concluded that the most likely route of exposure would be drinking contaminated groundwater. The residents in the study area are served by municipal water supplies, Otsego Township, and Plainwell, and in addition to private residential drinking water wells in the remainder of the study area. So what were the areas of concern? Three things rose to the top: farm fields that received paper sludge as a soil amendment, paper mills, and landfills. The Menasha landfill, the Mead landfill, and the A1 disposal landfill. Next slide, please. This picture is on top of the Menasha landfill. It's looking west to east. The landfill is approximately 4 acres in size, and this picture was taken in April, I believe, so not much vegetation growth. Next slide, please. This figure is from the data summary report dated April 16th, 2021. This report was prepared by Rose and Westra, they're a division of GZA, on behalf of Menasha Corporation. The figure depicts the landfill parcel in yellow. If you could point that out, Amy, thank you. The landfill study area is outlined in red to the north, and the landfill berm is outlined in gray and black inside the rectangle. The disturbed area to the south is the composting operation, and the former Menasha paper mill is located to the west of the landfill, north of the Kalamazoo River, depicted by the lighter colored parcels. Next slide, please. In 2018, Eagle collected groundwater samples from existing monitoring wells located on the landfill parcel. Menasha monitoring well 1 contained 34 part per trillion PFOA, and this is compared to the drinking water criterion of 8 part per trillion, and that well was located south of the composting operation. Menasha well TH4 contained 45.6 part per trillion PFOS, and this is compared to the drinking water criterion of 16 part per trillion, and this well was located on the north side of the landfill cap. Next slide, please. So we're jumping ahead to 2019. Eagle conducted 2 geoprobe borings, Menasha landfill SB1 and SB2. See the call out box to the left. SB1 was collected from waste material from a depth of 60 to 96 inches below ground surface. PFOA and PFOS were non-detected at this point, at this location. And moving to the call out box to the right of the slide, SB2 was collected from waste material from a depth of 60 to 108 inches below ground surface. PFOA was non-detected here also, but PFOS was detected at a concentration of 1.82 parts per billion. DU1 is represented by 50 yellow dots inside the black rectangle. At all 50 locations, a soil core was collected with a hand probe from surface to a depth of 1 foot below ground surface. All 50 cores were combined to yield one sample to represent the mean concentration of the landfill cap. And see the lower call out box. PFOA was detected in the surface soil at 2.92 part per billion, and PFOS was detected at 41.4 part per billion. So the cap contains more PFAS than soil boring 1 and soil boring 2, which were collected from the waste material. And I want to point out the bottom of all 3 call out boxes is TEQ. TEQ stands for toxic equivalency quotient, and TEQ is used to measure dioxins and furans. And all the dioxin furan results are below criteria for dioxin. Next slide, please. So this is a Menasha landfill investigation summary slide. So May 2020, Eagle received and approved the Menasha landfill investigation work plan. In July 2020, Menasha consultants collect soil and groundwater, surface water samples from the landfill. Eagle was also on site, and we collected 5 groundwater samples for PFAS analysis, 5 surface water samples for PFAS analysis, and 58 soil samples for PFAS analysis. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the drill rig. The driller used hollow stem auger drilling methods to reach the native soil beneath the bottom of the waste material in the landfill. The maximum depth of the waste material in the landfill is approximately 37 feet below ground surface. Next slide. This is a close-up of one of the soil borings. The landfill waste included sludges unsuitable for paper production, mill rejects, plastics, wire, etc., and fly ash from coal-fired boilers. Next slide, please. This slide has a lot of information. I just put it up here to orientate us a little bit. The black and white squares, if you could point some of those out, Amy, are monitoring wells. The orange circles are surface water samples. We sample various ponds around the landfill. And I want to highlight the purple triangles in the center of the screen. They are the temporary monitoring wells. And the next slide is going to zoom into this area. Next slide, please. So this is the Menasha landfill groundwater PFAS results. And I'd like to direct your attention to the legend. The legend has 7 numbers in it, in the parentheses. The first number is total PFAS, and the second number highlighted in yellow is the PFOA, and the third is PFOS, and then the remaining 4 compounds that the state of Michigan has PFAS criteria for. So we're going to focus on this slide just on PFOA. And the PFOA concentrations range from 57.8 part per trillion in Menasha temporary well 3, that's the upper right call out box, to a maximum concentration of 158 part per trillion in monitoring well TW-2, that's the lower call out box. And I would like to also point out that all PFOA concentrations from all 3 temporary monitoring wells exceed Eagle's Part 201 drinking water criterion of 8 part per trillion. These monitoring wells are screened in the waste material, and the groundwater samples were collected at depth to determine if the waste material in the landfill is leaching PFAS into the groundwater. And one last thing I'd like to point out is PFOS concentrations in the temp wells do not exceed the drinking water criterion, which is 16 part per trillion. And that's the third number. Thank you, Amy. Next slide, please. Well, this is a photo of Pond 2. It's located on the north side of the landfill. And you can see just to the right of the screen, the concrete pad, that's where monitoring well TH4 is located. There is quite a difference in elevation, the landfill cap down to the pond. I'd like to also point that out. Next slide, please. Again, we have in the legend, we have the same information in parentheses. We have total PFAS, second number is PFOA, and then PFOS is the third number. We're going to look at PFOS results on this slide. And if you could highlight Menasha Storm 01 in the lower left there, the call out boxes, it contains PFOS at 4,810 parts per trillion. This sample represents water running off the cap, which eventually ends up in pond 2. Now, if you'd highlight the pond sample, please. The pond sample contained 2,090 part per trillion PFOS, and this number would be compared to the surface water quality value of 12 part per trillion for PFOS. And those numbers are also on the right-hand side of the slide. And if you recall, the groundwater from the temporary wells, the concentrations were below drinking water criteria for PFOS. So it appears that the stormwater runoff from the landfill cap is impacting surface water in pond 2 more than groundwater leaching from inside the landfill. Next slide, please. Menasha also conducted 8 soil borings on the landfill. And if you look at a legend, we only have 3 numbers this time. The first one is still total PFAS, then PFOA, and then PFOS. And I would like to just highlight one of the samples here. On the upper left, the call out box, Menasha soil boring 04. It was collected from a depth of 0 to 6 inches. It contained 1.9 part per billion PFOA and 36.4 part per billion PFOS. And if you recall, the Eagle sampled the landfill cap with the 50 cores from the top foot of the landfill cap, and the mean concentration was 2.92 part per billion PFOA and 41.4 part per billion PFOS. This data correlates well with the discrete sampling. And I would also like to highlight one other thing on this slide, the yellow square. The yellow square is a pond 2 sediment sample, and it was non-detect for PFOA and 57.4 part per billion PFOS. This is very similar to the landfill cap results. Next slide, please. Some main points and conclusions. And usually the units for PFAS in soil are expressed in parts per billion and parts per trillion for groundwater. So on this slide, I did both. The landfill cap contains PFOA in soil at 2.92 parts per billion, and this is equivalent to 2,920 parts per trillion. And likewise, PFOS at 41.4 part per billion equates to 41,400 part per trillion. The stormwater runoff from the cap contained PFOA at 931 part per trillion and PFOS at 4,810 part per trillion at Menasha storm sample 01. Where the pond contained the PFOA at 321 part per trillion and PFOS at 2,090 part per trillion. So pond 2 contains diluted stormwater runoff from the cap. So the groundwater beneath the fill in the landfill, which when we looked at the purple triangles or the temporary monitoring well data, it contained PFOA at 158 part per trillion. And the PFOS was less than the drinking water criterion of 16 part per trillion. Runoff from the cap seems to contribute more PFAS to the ponds than leachate from within the landfill. And the conclusions, the landfill is not preventing PFAS from migrating off-site. And there's also evidence in the file that paper sludge was placed on top of the cap to promote root growth. And this is the likely reason we're seeing the elevated PFAS concentrations in the cap. Next slide, please. So we're going to move over to the paper mill. So the Eagle investigation at the former Menasha paper mill, this work was completed July of 2022. Eagle collected 20 groundwater samples from monitoring wells and production wells at the former Menasha paper landfill. The soil samples were also collected from the former aeration lagoon and former spent liquor lagoon. Next slide, please. This slide, I'll talk a little bit about the history of the Menasha paper mill. The site was operated as a paper mill by Menasha Corporation from 1939 through August of 2005. Menasha operations consisted of kraft pulping, fiber reclamation from old cardboard, and paper making processes. Menasha manufactured food grade corrugated medium at the mill. And now we'll focus on the slide. The Kalamazoo River is located immediately to the south of the mill property, and it flows east to west. The groundwater at the paper mill flows to the southwest to the river. And if you look at the call out boxes, the yellow indicates exceedances of drinking water criteria. An orange box indicates an exceedance of both drinking water criteria and groundwater surface water interface criteria. The blue ellipse on the bottom right is the spent liquor lagoon. The green rectangle is the eastern half of the former aeration lagoon. The purple circles are new monitoring wells, and the blue circles are existing monitoring wells. Now to the data. The highest groundwater sample was 723 part per trillion PFOA, and this is compared to the criterion, which is 8 part per trillion. And this was collected in the green rectangle at Aeration Lagoon Monitoring Well 1. The highest PFOA sample was 511 part per trillion, and this is compared to the groundwater criterion of 16 part per trillion, and this was collected from Monitoring Well 2 in the Aeration Lagoon. The highest PFNA sample was 34.8 compared to the criterion of 6 part per trillion, and this was collected also at Monitoring Well 1 in the Aeration Lagoon. So next slide, please. Oh, let's just skip ahead. We covered this on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights recent investigation reports. The Eagle Otsego Area Study Remedial Investigation Summary Report was in draft format still. It was dated July 26, 2022. This includes 2 Eagle Tech memos prepared by our Geological Services section. And this report covers work by Eagle from 2018 through 2021. The second report, the Eagle Former Menasha Paper Mill Soil and Groundwater Investigation Report. This report's dated March 7th, 2023. This report covers the paper mill activities discussed above from July of 2022. And the third report listed there is the data summary report for the Menasha Paper Landfill. And that was drafted April 16th or dated April 16th, 2021. That was prepared, I said earlier, by Rose and Westra, the division of GZA, and submitted by Menasha Corporation. So we have 3 investigation reports on file that can be reviewed. The next slide, please. Next steps. Eagle will review and provide oversight of the presumptive remedy at the landfill. So Menasha Corporation has submitted a work plan to Eagle for the presumptive remedy, and they submitted this report on February 21st of this year. And Eagle is currently reviewing the work plan and will be, providing approval back to Menasha within the next couple of weeks. The second bullet, Eagle will work with responsible parties to investigate PFAS contamination at the paper mill. And the last bullet, we will continue to work to identify other sludge application fields with targeted residential well sampling. And this concludes my update. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Matthew Pfister, and I'm with the Emerging Pollutants section with WRD. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the surface water investigations and where they currently stand. Okay, so in December 2018, Eagle started our investigation by looking at the Kalamazoo River watershed. In that investigation, we took 3 samples, 1 upstream and 2 downstream samples, with 1 detection for PFOS above water quality criteria, which is 12 parts per trillion in this area. So in December 2018 through January of 2019, both Eagle and Otsego Paper Incorporated sampled the effluent monitoring point 003A from the Otsego paper plant. And results showed non-detect for all PFAS analytes at that time. We continued to sample, and so in May 2019, additional samples were collected of the same outfall, and PFOS and PFOA were detected, but both below our water quality criteria. And then in April 2021, Eagle collected an additional sample from outfall 003A, and PFOS was detected just above water quality criteria. And I'll call this out on our next slide, don't go there yet, which actually has a map of the results. And then based on that April 2021 result, Eagle did request a short-term stormwater characterization study, which looks at stormwater outfalls and industrial direct outfalls. And that study was concluded by Otsego paper in Q4 of 2022. So based on the information that we have and the information that will be in the next slide, we're going to continue to work with Otsego paper to address the elevated levels on 3 of the outfalls. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the initial elevated 2018 surface water sample. So that is in the bottom left corner, and that is downstream of the plant. And then the 2022 wastewater characterization, you had outfall A2 with 67 parts per trillion, outfall J with 52 parts per trillion, and then outfall 3 with 29 part per trillion. And, you know, in comparison to other facilities that we've looked at in the EPS, plating facilities, things like that, we've seen results as high as, you know, 1,000 parts per trillion to 15,000 parts per trillion. So seeing something in the range of 30-ish to 67, it is above our water quality values, but it's not overly alarming. And then on the far right side, you have the 2023 Plainwell wastewater treatment plant results. And that effluent goes into the Kalamazoo River, and that was 15.43 parts per trillion. So there are other sources adding to this watershed. Next slide, please. And then this is just a map and a summary of the 2018 sampling. So the red diamond that's being pointed out right now, that is the facility. And then downstream, the red dot for PFOS was 49 parts per trillion. And then there's another downstream, yep, in orange, and that's 9.2, so below our water quality values. And then one sample taken upstream, which still showed elevated levels, but below our criteria at 10 part per trillion. So that is the high level review of surface water.
Let's check it in for Heather. Heather, oh, there you are. Okay.
Good evening. My name is Heather Bishop, and I am the supervisor for Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division for the Community Water Supply Program in the Kalamazoo District Office. So essentially, we regulate city water. So I wanted to share tonight the most recent results for the 3 communities, 3 municipalities that are in the area. So this is their most recent PFAS results. All the samples were collected in 2022, and Otsego City has a range between, for the compounds that you can see on the screen. And this represents what was detected, not everything that was tested. So you can see the list of the Michigan drinking water standards on the right, and that would represent minimally everything that is tested. Plainwell and Otsego Township have separate water systems, and they both had not detect results. As Ray mentioned, this investigation has been going on for quite some time, and so I wanted to share some activities that have taken place on the community water supply side since the investigation began. So in April 2018 is when the statewide community water sampling began to look for PFAS in city, basically in city or municipal water. In the summer of 2019, the MPART Science Advisory Committee released the health-based values that ended up becoming the state drinking water standards. And as a result of those values, the city of Plainwell plugged one of their wells that had PFAS detections. They have 2 other wells that are still in service that do not have detections. In August of 2020 is when the PFAS drinking water standard became effective, and that requires all community water supplies to minimally sample once a year. Supplies that have detections are typically on quarterly monitoring, where they sample every 3 months. In December of 2020, Andrews Estates Manufactured Housing Community, which is in Otsego Township, was able to connect to Otsego Township water system. So they previously had their own small water system there at Andrews Estates, and it had PFAS detections in the wells. And so they were able to connect to Otsego Township in order for those residents to have an improvement in their drinking water quality. That was a state grant funded project. And then in July of 2022, Eagle executed a grant again with Otsego Township to extend water to the Hazelwood subdivision. And that subdivision currently has private wells with PFAS detections in them. So it will allow everybody in that subdivision to connect to the Otsego Township system. As of today, we are currently reviewing the permit for that water main extension. So once we've completed our permit review and issue that permit, then construction can begin.
All right, thanks, Heather. So we're bringing it back around to the front. At this point, we're done with the presentations, and we're opening it up to questions that you all might have that are attending. Just want to let you know we've got about 37 people logged in tonight. If you had a chance, please check the chat. Lisa Heron and I have been dropping in some links that you might want to see that you might find useful, as well as a copy of today's presentation. So you can find that in there as well. So I'm gonna bring my team back up here. So if you guys want to turn your cameras, you can. There's Abby, good. And Abby, I'm gonna kick it off. If you see some other questions that pop in there, you can go ahead and ask them as well. I'll ask the first question. This came up way back when I think Fred was doing his presentation on sources of PFAS. And the question is there a program to prevent the use of waste treatment plant sludge as fertilizer? So that might be more of a question for Heather or Matt.
Why don't I take a
go
first
ahead,
crack at
yeah.
it, and I'll let Steph jump in here in a second. There's a couple of things that have changed, I guess, in the last few years since we started looking from the investigation of this particular site, as well as others across the state. The state does have, when we talk about biosolids, which are specifically treated wastewater treatment plant sludges, treated sludges, not paper waste like this. Biosolids refer to, at least in Michigan, refer to those wastewater treatment plant sludges. Those are under a interim biosolids strategy. And so all biosolids that are being applied in the state of Michigan for the last 3 years have been sampled. They're sampled before they are applied to any soils of the state, and they have to meet minimum requirements. Otherwise, they are applied at a half the normal agronomic rate. So we do have a current process in place when it comes to land application of other materials. They go through a separate process, and we are, currently reviewing those as well. At this point, there are a number of different processes, both within our land application programs and for fertilizer, that PFAS testing is being required on all of those things before they're land applied. Fred, anything else you want to add to that as far as land application that you can think of that I missed?
No, they would have to, if they were gonna land apply any sort of industrial sludge, they need to sample it for PFAS compounds and make sure that it was below any standard before we would allow it to be land applied.
Mhm. But it's a good question. I mean, other states are very much struggling with some of these issues. And it's not to say that we don't have some historical issues as we are finding with this, but at least going forward, we won't be allowing land application of PFAS at significant industrially impacted levels.
Abby, we got a question here, and this goes back to Ray's when you had some of the maps of sampling that came up. There were 2 locations near Otsego, but outside of the city center that had some high levels of PFAS. What are those locations?
Maybe Amy can go back to the map. Yeah,
It's a ways back there.
probably the drinking water map that he had. Or maybe we're looking at the one that Lisa had. I think it's the one Lisa had up, right?
Yeah, I think so. And so they're the 2 kind of areas that I think they're referring to. The first is the Hazelwood neighborhood, which is outside of Otsego, and then the other one is the 2nd Street area, which is actually in Kalamazoo County.
Mm-hmm. And we think those are potentially associated with land application then, Lisa?
Yeah.
Those 2 areas are detailed on the MPART site if you want to plug that location.
Yeah, and those I think all got put into the chat. So
Yes.
there's like 15 different maps and figures on the MPART website as well.
Yeah, we did add some of the links into the chat. You can find them in there. We do have a person with their hand raised. Sherry, you can go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question.
Hi, I have maybe a few questions or comments. The first one, is there any kind of recourse for homeowners? For example, like I had to pay to hook up to the Otsego Township water. I'm in the Hazelwood neighborhood, but I didn't qualify under the grant. And also kind of a comment going forward is to maybe look at the process. The township had told Ingo that I was connected to the water. I was not. So for about 2 years, I was still drinking my well water and probably exposed. My water was never tested. So, and then my other question is, what are these health, I don't know, negative health, is the impact long-term or short-term? How do you know? And how do you know, like, how long does this stay in your body for?
Yeah, so I can answer your last question, Sherry. And so we consider PFAS exposure to be a concern when it's chronic, and chronic is defined as more than a year long. And so some of these PFAS compounds like PFOS have a pretty long half-life, on the scale of like, I think it's eight years for PFOS, if I'm not mistaken. And so generally the longer chain PFAS that have a long carbon chain stay in the human body for a longer period of time. So that's kind of the general rule of thumb with PFAS.
But it's not one of those things, Lisa, correct me, it's not one of those things where we're gonna see instantaneous health effects. It would probably be a lifetime exposure that might
Yes.
produce something.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're talking about, you know, a lifetime exposure is defined as 70 years. Yep.
So, but good question. And Sherry, reach out to Ray with specifics on your address and stuff, just so we can look into your case a little bit more. Thank you. So it looks like we got a question on reverse osmosis systems in homes. Do reverse osmosis systems in homes help filter out PFAS and PFOS?
I can take that one.
Great.
So the preferred treatment, or the most frequent treatment for PFAS compounds, is granulated activated carbon. And there are sometimes granulated activated carbon pre and post filters in a reverse osmosis system. So I wouldn't necessarily go out and get one with the hope that it's going to work. But there's a possibility that it would. There are the National Sanitation Foundation, which we commonly refer to as NSF, actually does a certification process for PFAS filters. And you could look up a filter that if you were interested in getting a filter for your home, you could look them up on NSF's website to see if they carry that PFAS certification. And that certification means that NSF as a third party has tested it to verify that the manufacturer's claims actually work. So like if they're saying it's going to remove X amount of PFAS, they verify that that is true. So, and I can put a link for NSF in the question. However that goes in the question and answer thing, we can get a link for the NSF.
In the chat, yeah.
Yeah.
I know that we have tested a few RO systems around the state, but it's not something we normally do. If they're properly maintained, they could be effective for PFAS, but it's one of those things that they have to be properly maintained, and like Heather said, we'd we're kind of relying on the certified systems, certified filters to make sure that that those are actually being effective.
Yeah, and I will say, like, reverse osmosis by itself would not. So the reverse osmosis membrane, that's not what it's designed to do. You need the carbon to absorb the PFAS. So it would only be the pre and post carbon filters that would actually take out or reduce PFAS. So yeah, and we really want to look for that certification so that it's third party verified.
Mm-hmm.
There's one in there too, Abby, about treatment at the treatment plant.
I would say I could take that one too.
Okay.
Yeah, let's read it real quick. So it says, are there any technology-based solutions being proposed for municipal water supplies that would eliminate PFAS from drinking water systems before they go into distribution? So go ahead, Heather.
So the answer to that is yes. Granulated activated carbon is the technology that's approved in the Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act. And I believe there's a couple of community water supplies in the state that have added that. So, there's certainly a possibility that other technologies could be used and approved. But as part of the development of a maximum contaminant level in the Safe Drinking Water Act, there has to be a preferred treatment solution listed in the act for each compound that has a drinking water standard. So granulated activated carbon is the preferred treatment technology currently in the Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act.
Okay. Looking at our question box, we don't have any questions in there right now, so I'm going to give people another chance to type them in. Also remember, you can raise your hand if you have a question. If you're on the telephone listening in, you can hit #2 on your phone and that'll raise your hand for us to unmute you.
Mhm.
So I don't know if there's anything you want to go over, cover area. We're waiting to see if there's any more questions coming in.
Yeah, we can give it another couple minutes and see. All right, so we got one on, will we receive a recording of this meeting? I don't think a link is actually sent to participants, but we do post it on our YouTube Eagle channel. Or do we send an actual link, Jim?
Yeah, we can do either. We can put it up on the website. We can also, if you want the email that you got to join this meeting, just hit reply. It comes back to me. And my contact information, I can send you a link directly. That's fine. But we'll be posting it on the YouTube channel as well. And I'll have Lisa put a link to the YouTube channel into the chat so you can find it there.
Yeah.
And it'll be up there by probably Friday.
Yep. And then we have, and I think, did we post a link to the MPART page for the new sites?
Yes, we put
Yes,
a
we did.
link in
Okay.
there for the landfill, and yeah, so you can find it there.
So just to clarify that and point that out, because this is started as an Otsego study area, we now have enough data to specifically list both the Menasha landfill as an MPART site and the Menasha paper mill as an MPART site. So those two sites will receive their own separate web pages, and we'll have write-ups specific to those. So if you are looking for some additional information, you'll see the similar slides to what you saw tonight. They'll be up on those particular web pages.
Yeah,
All
I'm adding the link to the paper mill as well in there because that wasn't in there, but I just sent it out.
Okay, perfect. And it says, if we have other questions, who should be our point of contact? You can always start with Ray for all site-specific information. If you want to talk about health questions, I would talk with Lisa Fisher with MDHHS. And then, general PFAS MPART questions, you can always contact me as well, or any of our panelists here on the, I think all of their names and phone numbers were in the slides, so you've always got those. All right. And
Okay, a couple more came in.
Yeah, it looks like we got one specific for Ray. When samples were drilled in the Menasha landfill, why only 37 feet deep? Would the results differ if it was deeper? So maybe Amy can go to the slide with the Menasha sampling data on it.
I took out the cross-section slide, but 37 feet below ground surface was the maximum depth of the waste in the landfill. So the contractor drilled until he reached native soil, and then he terminated the investigative borings.
So Ray, is this a type of landfill that would have a cap or a liner, any kind of a engineered cap or engineered liner for this landfill?
Oh, maybe Fred could help me with that question at the date it was closed. I'm not really sure. According to the work.
Yeah, at the time this landfill was initially built, it wasn't required to have a specific lining material. The cap, if you will, that's there, the sludge mixed with soil was actually supposed to, I guess, help protect and to provide better strata for vegetation to grow on. So it was thought to be, it was actually proposed as an enhancement, but we didn't know about PFAS at the time. So.
All right, excellent. So there is a spot here that we're talking about. Whoops, did you want to add something, Fred?
Well, I was just gonna say the second part of that question, I don't know, they asked if the results would differ if the samples were taken deeper, but I thought Ray answered that, but I bet you that other groundwater samples were actually collected at deeper levels. But
Yeah, those 3 temporary wells were screened at various depths, and some of them were screened at least 20-some feet down into the fill material. So you are capturing the water that percolated down through the waste material.
So we do have a good idea of the vertical gradient of concentrations as you go down through the waste.
We do, and both the soil and the groundwater testing indicated that the PFAS present in the cap material was greater than the PFAS present in the groundwater and the soils down in the landfill material.
Excellent. Now I see a question here on someone that we can contact to request testing of our household wells. Amy, is it possible you could bring up the MPART website and show people where they could go to see the list of labs that do household testing? So Amy's bringing up our MPART website, and it is michigan.gov or MPART. You can either type in MPART into the Google browser or type in PFAS response, michigan.gov PFAS response. This will bring you to our landing page. On this page, if you click the drinking water and wells, there is a drop-down tab here. It says laboratories offering home testing. And so we've got a variety of labs that will do that. They'll send you a home testing kit that you can do it yourself. You don't have to hire someone to come out and do it. And there is a list of 8 or 10 of them here. Our Eagle lab will do it for you. It does cost, we've got the prices on here for you so you get an idea. $290 for that. That's for our drinking water analysis of method 533, and I believe it is 28 analytes.
25.
25.
You're so close.
I'm never getting that right.
That's right.
So anyways, it's a great question. Then you can get the things. If you do test your own well, and you're willing to share that data with us, please do. Please share it with Ray or myself or anyone here on the team, because it really does help us keep track of the big picture. And if your house is above criteria or above a drinking water level, please let us know. And even if it's not, even if you get a non-detect, it would be really good for us to know who's testing. And if you know the depth of your well depth makes a big difference. If you've got a very shallow well, those are the ones that we would really like to see tested. There is no requirement out there for PFAS testing of your drinking water well. So that's one of the things that's our goal this year, is to really reach out to residents and encourage as much of the private well testing as possible. Even if you're not necessarily next to one of these fields or next to Menasha, it's always a good idea to do some PFAS testing.
And Abby, if I could jump in for one more extra second, there's a question under each one of these that says, are technicians available to collect the sample? And the answer is no for many of them, but there are, in some cases, some technicians available to come out at an extra, cost to do the sampling for you. I can tell you that I sampled my own well up north and got the test kits. They send you a box that has the instructions inside of it, and it's really super duper easy. So, you could order a test kit, and if it looks overly complicated, you probably even call the labs and they can walk you through it. Just thought I'd point that out.
The one thing to note about those is that you would want to do that testing before treatment. So if you have like a water softener on your system or something like that, you would want to test it before that any kind of filtration system, just to see what's coming out of your groundwater. Water softener won't take PFAS out. So like Heather said, you're not going to get any PFAS removal with that. But we like to know what's actually in your well. Often the outside spigot on your house will not be hooked up to any of that kind of filtration systems. So we often test from the outside spigot of houses to collect those samples.
I did add a link to this page that's just showing into the chat there.
Perfect. All right. I see there's a thing here for Lisa. Is there a way to get blood tested for PFAS?
Yeah, you can ask your doctor to have your blood tested for PFAS. It's not something that a lot of doctors are familiar with, so you would have to ask for it and kind of explain what you wanted it tested for. There's also some limitations on what that can tell you. For example, it can't tell you, like when you were exposed to PFAS or for how long, or kind of like where the PFAS was coming from. And like we talked about in the beginning, PFAS are in a number of consumer products. So it can't really nail down where you were exposed to PFAS. So there are some limitations on what information you can actually get from that blood result. So, but it's something that you kind of have to ask specifically from your doctor.
And Ray, I think you're up next. Can you speak to potential remediation at the landfill site? Are there any plans to cap the site, the landfill itself?
Ray, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was trying to mute some of the coughing there. So Menasha has submitted a presumptive remedy to Eagle to cap the landfill. And that came in, I believe, late February this year. It was on one of the slides. And it's currently under review by Eagle. And we'll be responding back with comments and approve that. And then I don't recall how quick the schedule was for when they will be in the field, but hopefully they'll be started on that later this year.
The follow-up to that then, Ray, is Menasha being held liable, and do we have any idea how long they have to clean it up?
Well, yes, Menasha is the liable party for the landfill. They were the sole operator and it only received waste from the mill. It didn't receive outside waste from the community. So there are no other contributors to the landfill other than the Menasha paper mill.
Right. And Lisa, can you explain if PFAS blood test is normal, does it mean there was not an exposure? Is it possible it may have excreted? Is that correct, through the half-life process?
Yeah, it's possible. A lot of these PFAS that have been historically used, so from the 1940s up until the early 2000s, those tend to have a longer half-life. So we're talking on the scale of years, years to decades. So if exposure was stopped and enough time had passed, then the PFAS blood levels would probably be maybe in the normal range. All I can really say is it's possible.
All
All
right.
right. I don't see any other questions in
You
there.
see any hands, Jim? I can't see.
No, I don't see any hands raised either. So maybe we'll give another chance if anybody has a question to type it in or raise your hand.
Mhm. I think it's important to note this is an ongoing investigation, ongoing process. As Ray said, he's got work plans on his desk. He's reviewing. There will be more stuff coming up, but we'll keep working through the process. We'll keep, as Lisa said, you're going to potentially get outreach if they've looked at houses near yours that had some exceedances. They may be reaching out to you to do additional sampling. So look for those outreach, and then we will continue to keep the community updated. But really appreciate everybody. All right, see anything else?
No, it doesn't look like we have any more questions in there, Abby. So I think we can wrap her up.
Share one more time. The recording for this is available. Is it on the MPART site?
Will
ahead.
be on the Eagle YouTube site. And if that didn't get put into the chat, if you just type in YouTube and then you type in EGLE, you'll get to the Eagle YouTube channel, and you can search put in PFAS and all the PFAS meetings will come up. But if you type in, Otsego PFAS, it should come up with that one. So even if you don't have the link, but as Jim said, should have it ready by Friday-ish. And then we can respond to people who would like an actual direct link. Otherwise
Yeah.
we will definitely make it available.
I'll do one better. We'll just send a link out to everybody who registered. So
There
so
we go.
we'll just,
Thank you.
as soon as it's available, I'll just either Lisa Heron or I will send a link out to you all. That way you have it. And 'cause I know a lot of you may have people who missed it, and you can forward it on to them or post it wherever you want.
Yep. Definitely want to keep everybody informed. So yes, and we do have some township officials and city officials and other people. So if we have that YouTube link available, we can get it posted on some of our local networks as well. So everybody can take a look at it.
Hey, Abby, so some of the people in the crowd here might have gone out to the website at one point and looked under the Otsego area of interest write-up. We're in the process of updating that, and that will link to these new 2 new sites. So we can also stick the recording in that too for future use.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, we'll try to make it very easy. But again, thank you everybody for coming tonight. It's nice to see so many people online with us participating in this, and we hope we found it useful and got a chance to get your questions answered.
All right.
All right. I don't see anything else popping up. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening.